Let's jump back into the discussion that we started on Thursday. Remember that we fell a little bit behind schedule, right? We had, I had my fault, my responsibility. I had set up the calendar at the beginning of the semester, not thinking clearly about how much time I needed to cover the topic on Congress. We had that Thursday holiday. We carried the topic on Congress over until the following Tuesday. That means that now we're carrying the topic on the presidency over till today. But we said we'll catch up this week because today we're going to finish up the topic on the presidency. And then on Thursday, we'll just have one class session to deal with the topic on bureaucracies. And that way we'll be back on schedule next week for the topic on the courts, okay? And then down through the end of the semester. Everything as it looks now will play out according to that schedule. Somebody had asked me in the last class session, I believe, about how that affects the reading assignments. And I'm not sure everybody got the answer to that, okay, because I think it might have been like as the class was leaving or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but the quick answer to that question is it doesn't really affect the reading assignments. Keep reading the assigned material for the remaining weeks as it is indicated on the course syllabus, so that when you come in on Thursday and take the reading quiz, for example, this Thursday, you'll take the reading quiz on the chapter on the presidency, okay? All right, so we had spent some time in Thursday's class meeting. We really, yes, sir. Who's, somebody have a question online?
Yeah, yes, sir. The camera's blocked, and I can't see the overhead.
Oh, okay. All right. I tried to wipe down the whiteboard, and it didn't work, and I set the paper towel in front of the webcam. Sorry about that. Okay, so let me get the application screen on. Thank you for alerting me to that. Okay, so you should now see a slide that says public expectations of presidential performance at the top.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
All right, good. We're ready to roll. All right, so we had spent some time on Thursday really just sort of breaking ground on this topic on the presidency. We had talked, for a while about public perceptions of presidential performance. And I think maybe the major point I wanted you to take away from that class session last time was that the biggest factor, the factor that has the biggest impact on public perceptions of presidential performance is the performance of the overall macroeconomy, okay? Now, obviously, it's not the total explanation because we noted in looking at the graph, and I'm not going to pull that graph back up, but you may remember when we were looking at that, we said, well, there are a couple of periods, at least a couple of periods along that timeline where based on the unemployment rate, we were using that as an indicator of the performance of the overall macroeconomy. There's no variable that economists or anybody else can measure called performance of the macroeconomy. You just kind of have to look at indicator variables. And for whatever reason, I like to use the unemployment rate. So we saw along that timeline, there was at least one or two periods where unemployment was historically low, that is to say below average over the period, but presidential approval was also low. And that's counter to our hypothesis, right? Because we said that they should be inversely related, that as the unemployment rate decreases, presidential approval should increase, right? And we said that was the general pattern. And by the way, what's the theory? What's the explanation behind that? Well, as I said last time, fairly or unfairly, valid or not valid, it suggests that somehow the American people have come to conclude that the president is the manager of the economy. And so if the economy is doing well, as measured by these indicator variables like the unemployment rate, then that must mean that the president is doing his job well. Right? Again, that may not be a fair way to assess presidential performance, but again, as I've said probably a couple of times in this class this semester already, in politics, perception is 99% of reality. It matters oftentimes less what is real or true than it, what people perceive to be true. So if people perceive that the president is the manager of the economy or should be able to manage the economy, or that somehow the presidency has some tools available to it that allows the president to manage the economy, it's just a matter of whether the individual holding the office can adequately use those tools. Okay? So again, for most of that period, that 70-year period, we saw that relationship, but there were a couple of times, and we attributed that. It could be a number of things, but we talked about how specific events along the timeline might impact the way that the public perceives the president. Sort of running counter to what should be happening as a result of the relatively good or relatively poor unemployment numbers. For example, we looked at the two periods, war periods, right? The period of the Vietnam War during the Johnson presidency, when the economy was, in above average, performance, and unemployment was below average. I guess that's the way we should say it. But President Johnson's approval ratings were below average, right? And then also the period during the Second Gulf War, right? And during the Iraq War, to be more precise, during George W. Bush's presidency, when the economy for most of that period was in pretty good shape. But President Bush's approval ratings, kept coming down as that war, extended out over time. And most analysts agree that, the American public only has so much tolerance for a war that seems to have no ready victory in sight, right? So unfortunately for President Bush, that, weighed on his approval ratings. Okay? So anyway, at the end of the class period last time, we, began talking a little bit about this notion of the honeymoon period, because we said that at the beginning of each president's term, there is a period of time, and I can't tell you exactly how long that runs because it's different for each president, right? But there's a period of time, maybe several weeks or months, whatever the case is. It's longer for some, shorter for others, where the public seems to be giving the president the benefit of the doubt. And we see that approval ratings are high. But over the course of the president's term of office, they generally come down, although we noted that there was one exception to that. Which president did we say ended up higher at the end of his term than at the beginning of his term?
William Jefferson Clinton.
Yeah, Bill Clinton. Interestingly enough, Bill Clinton ended up actually not only higher than where he started, but he also ended up with higher approval ratings than any president on that timeline. When he left office, he was higher than any of them. So, and then Trump was a bit of an exception too, because Trump's approval ratings varied over a much smaller range. He didn't go up, he didn't really go, well, he went down certainly towards the end of his term there the last few weeks, but he was pretty consistently over his 4 years from like 41 to 46%, something like that. So he never had, I don't think there was ever a period of time where a majority of Americans said that they approved of President Trump's performance, right? Okay, so, we talked a little bit about the honeymoon effect and what possible explanations for that. Now, one thing, did we talk about this idea last time? The media? Oh, okay. Well, I guess we didn't get into it then. So, this notion of the media presidency suggests that the way that the media, popular news media, covers the presidency, particularly since the beginning of the television era, which is exactly the period of time that time series covers, right? Who was the first president on that time series graph? Do you remember? The time series graph that I put up last time that showed the presidential approval ratings, who was the first president? Eisenhower, right? Eisenhower was president during what decade?
50s.
The 1950s, right? And that is really when, it's not literally when TV was invented, but that was the period in our history where televisions were in most households, right? So people began in the 1950s getting their news primarily from television coverage, but radio and newspapers as well, and of course more recently a variety of internet news sources as well. The basic idea is here, the way that the media covers presidential activities exaggerates the power of the institution of the presidency. You know, does anybody watch the nightly news broadcast anymore? You know, those 30-minute news broadcasts that come on at 5:30 here in local time, the CBS Evening News or the NBC Nightly News or ABC World News, whatever they're called, CNN. Well, I don't know if CNN has a program like that. To be honest with you, I don't really watch CNN or Fox or any of those things, but I don't even really watch the CBS or NBC or ABC anymore. I just occasionally will catch a news broadcast. But certainly during the heyday of this period that we're talking about, when this was the primary conduit of information for most Americans, okay, television news, you tune into one of those nightly news broadcasts, and maybe on a typical news day, maybe the first 10 minutes of the news broadcast, maybe more, maybe 12, 15 minutes of the news broadcast might be devoted to the activities of the president that day. So in the first story, you see the president signing some important legislation in the Oval Office, some sort of bill signing ceremony. And then in the next story, you see the president out in, you know, Michigan or someplace giving a speech on, you know, trade. And then maybe in the next story, you see the president, you know, somewhere in the Midwest, maybe in Missouri or someplace like that, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and helping the locals move bags of sand or something like that. I don't think we've seen any stories like that with the last couple of presidents. It's hard to imagine seeing Donald Trump and maybe even Joe Biden, but maybe we just haven't had enough time with Joe Biden. But certainly there have been plenty of news stories historically, you know, that kind of presidential activity. Okay, so the point is that analysts who study the presidency and public perceptions of the presidency argue that that kind of news coverage leaves people with a false impression about the power of the presidency. It makes the presidency appear larger than life. So Americans began attaching these, you know, grandiose notions of power to the presidency as an institution. Then it just becomes a matter of finding the right person to serve in that institutional role. It's almost as if these analysts argue that Americans are looking for, you know, the guy to come riding in on a white horse and save us from all our problems. That notion of presidential power really goes back before the television era. I think that we can trace that certainly to the Roosevelt era. The presidency changed pretty dramatically during that period of our history, particularly during Roosevelt. There are antecedents of that, or there are hints of, you know, about that in a couple of the earlier presidents. But it was really with the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt that these ideas began to develop about the powers of the institution of the presidency. Okay, so that's one possible explanation for that honeymoon effect, right? That people have these notions about the power of the institution, and they become quite hopeful about the ability of this newly elected person, whether they voted for him or not, the ability of this newly elected person to fulfill the great promise of this institution. But then when things don't work out as great as people hoped, they begin to reassess whether or not this is actually the right person to, you know, wield these great powers. And the public approval ratings come down as a consequence. That's essentially the argument that some analysts make in emphasizing this notion of the media presidency. Okay? Now, I certainly think the media has, the popular news media has to bear some share of the responsibility in perpetuating these inaccurate notions of presidential power. But I'm not one of these people that's going to lay everything at the feet of the news media. I think they've got some, I certainly have some criticisms of the way that the news media, popular news media operates, but I certainly wouldn't lay the entirety of this misperception at the feet of the media. Academics must share some of that responsibility as well. So this explanation, the textbook presidency, suggests that the way that sort of textbook treatments of the presidency present the powers and the roles and the duties of the presidency also exaggerate the power of the institution. You can pick up almost any introductory American government textbook, the one that we're using in this course, the We the People textbook that we're using in this course. But any other American government textbook that's used in introductory college American government courses, college level American government courses. I've seen a lot of these textbooks over the years, okay? Over the 36 or 37 years now that I've been on a college faculty somewhere, I've seen a lot of these textbooks because the publishers, less today than they used to, but even still to some extent today, they will send political science professors copies of their textbook and ask us to look at the textbook and consider it for adoption, because they always argue their textbook is so superior to the competition and your students will benefit enormously if you adopt our textbook. So I've seen a lot of these things, a lot of them collected on my shelves over the years. When I left my previous faculty position at Temple College in Central Texas to come here to Wharton County Junior College, I decided to clean out my shelves, clean off my shelves, because I didn't want to take a lot of that stuff with me. Are you guys like me when you have a task like that? You have to, like, maybe you're moving or you're just trying to clear out some space, some old stuff, and you get your attention gets diverted, like you start looking. So that's what happened to me, right? I was in my office, my former office, and my goal was to get rid of a lot of these textbooks because I didn't want to take them with me. And I got diverted. I started looking through these textbooks, and for whatever reason, I started looking at the chapter on the presidency in these textbooks. And it occurred to me as I was doing that to make a list, okay? To make a list of the powers or the duties, the roles or responsibilities that are attributed by authors of textbooks to the presidency. Because they all do it, including the textbook that we're using in this course. There's some sort of section, I forget exactly how they lay it out in the textbook that we're using, but there's some sort of section that has a heading that says duties of the president or powers or responsibilities of the president, something like that, okay? Here are some of the roles, responsibilities, powers, duties, whatever term you want to use there, that most of these textbooks had in common, okay? These textbooks, and some of them went back like to the 1980s, okay? Some of the textbooks all of them actually referred to the president as the head of state. They all referred to the president as the chief executive or listed out as one of the powers of the president, commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, chief legislative crisis manager. And then from there, some of them had the rest of these and some of them didn't, right? Protector of the people, manager of the economy, leader of the free world, chief of the party, head of government, voice of the people, chief policymaker. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but these were just some of the ones that were very common in these textbooks that I looked at. This approach to analyzing the powers of the presidency really goes back to the 1940s when a political scientist named Clinton Rossiter wrote a book on the American presidency, and that was sort of his approach for a good chunk of his book, where he was talking about these duties and roles and responsibilities. And so ever since then, authors of introductory textbooks have some sort of section like that on the powers and duties of the presidency. Okay? But as you look at this list, okay, I want you to tell me, if you can, which of these supposed powers of the presidency actually have a basis in the Constitution, because we haven't made a big enough deal. Usually, most semesters, I make a really big deal of this point, and I really haven't made a hugely big deal of this point. I've mentioned it once or twice earlier in the semester, but I'm going to make a really big deal of this point right now, okay? The theory of our system of government, whether we're talking about the presidency or whether we're talking about the Congress or the courts, the three branches of our government, the theory of our system of government is that no branch of government has any power except that which is vested in it by the Constitution. Okay? I'm going to repeat that because that's really an important point for an introductory American government course. The theory of our system of government is that no branch of government, neither Congress, nor the president, nor the courts, have any power except that which is vested in it by the Constitution. Now, made that point briefly in passing in our topic on the Congress, right? I think we briefly looked at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Does that sound familiar? Right? Remember, at the top of Article 1, Section 8, it says Congress will have the power to, and then it lists the powers that Congress has. Okay? Some of you are nodding your head, yes, you remember that. That's an example of, the theory of our Constitution. Congress has those powers. Okay, so my question for you is, as you look at this list, which of these powers are explicitly vested in the president by the Constitution?
First
Anybody
three.
want to give us one? Say it again.
First three.
The first three. Well, there's nothing in the Constitution that says the president shall be the head of state. So that one's not in the Constitution. Okay? Number two, well, there are no numbers by them, but if we're just going down that left column there, chief executive, yes, the Constitution does denote the president is chief executive. But let me just say this, and we're going to talk about this role in a little bit more detail here in a few minutes. It almost makes it appear ministerial. It almost makes it appear administrative in nature, because it says he shall be chief executive, which, by the way, implies, does it not, that there's going to be other executives, right? It's hard to be chief executive if you're the only one. But the Constitution doesn't mention those other executives, other than the vice president, right? But doesn't mention the Secretary of State. It doesn't mention the Secretary of Agriculture. It doesn't mention any of the cabinet secretaries or any other executive officer, right? But we can, I think, safely say that the framers of the Constitution must have believed that there would be other executives. Why else refer to the president as chief executive? Okay? But it follows that by saying he shall be chief executive and he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's what I mean when I say it makes it sound almost ministerial, as if the president is somehow the agent of Congress. Congress makes the law, and then the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, faithful to what? Presumably faithful to the intent of Congress. I don't want to overstate that point, because I think there's really a lot of good evidence that not all of the framers of the Constitution were of like mind on executive power and legislative power, but just like we aren't today, okay? But I think it is fairly safe to say that they were envisioning a presidency that was not nearly as enhanced as what we contemplate today. And so this idea that it may be an overstatement to say ministerial in nature, but I think most of them believed that that was the principal function of the presidency, to take care that the will of Congress be faithfully executed. That when Congress passes a law, it intends for this or that, whatever is specified, to be executed. You also said number 3, okay, the third one on the list, that also is in the Constitution. The president is commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, but it doesn't say what that means. So we can get into that here in a few minutes. Historically, there's been a lot of debate over what the power of commander-in-chief actually entails. Does it mean that the president gets to decide when and where and under what circumstances and for how long the United States makes war with another country? It doesn't say that. It doesn't say he shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, and therefore he decides when and where and for how long and under what circumstances we go to war with another country.
Doesn't he get the first 30 days though?
Well, we're going to get into that. I don't want to jump too far ahead. I promise you we'll come back to that. Okay? All I'm really trying to impress upon you right now is that the Constitution on this point, as with many things in the Constitution, is very vague. It's vague. What does it mean to be? Maybe it just means that Congress decides, and once Congress decides when and where and for how long and under what circumstances we make war, then the president is the chief general. Like the president decides, how many cruise missiles are going to be launched, or how many, F-14 sorties. Is that a fighter jet, F-14? Do they use that anymore, the F-14? Or is that outdated? B-52s, do they still use B-52s? Whatever they have, I don't know, in their arsenal. The president gets to decide, right, how many sorties they're going to fly. Maybe that's what commander-in-chief means. Constitution doesn't say. Okay? Okay, other than that, that's it. Those are the two, chief executive and commander-in-chief. Of all the powers that are on this list, those are the only two that are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Did you have a question, Joanna?
Yeah, chief diplomat, if it's given the power to make treaties with other countries, would that
Well, we kind of infer that means that the president is the chief diplomat. But certainly the Constitution does not say chief diplomat. It does say chief executive, and it does say commander-in-chief, but it doesn't say chief diplomat. Okay? It certainly doesn't say that foreign policy and diplomacy are the exclusive domain of the president. And we have seen, occasionally in our history, at least occasionally, where other political figures in our system have tried to initiate foreign policy moves, maybe not received well by the president, or in other circumstances maybe better received, but the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that the president has exclusive domain over that, or exclusive authority over that area of policy. Again, it's just one of those things that we kind of assume. And when I say we, I don't just mean the American public. I think to a large extent, the modern Congress has come to assume that as well. Okay, so all of these others are really supposed or evolved powers of the presidency. All right, now what I want to do, again, I don't want to lose track, I don't want to digress too much on that point, because we've got some specific things that we need to cover before the alarm goes off and we watch, or we take the quiz. So I want to make sure we get through some of this stuff. What we have, arguably, is a lot of mythology that's built up around the institution of the presidency. The American people in the early 21st century generally assume that the presidency is much more powerful than it actually is. They certainly assume that it's much more powerful than what was created back in the late 18th century when the Constitution was written. So let me just start with that point. Okay? What did the framers of the Constitution intend when they created the institution or the office of the presidency? I want you to remember that the Constitution was written in 1787. It took effect in 1789, and the first president, George Washington, was inaugurated in 1789. Okay? However, the United States declared their independence from Britain in 1776. So there was a period there of a dozen years before the Constitution was ratified, before the Constitution went into effect, after independence and before the Constitution went into effect, a dozen or so years, 13 years to be precise, where the United States did not operate under the Constitution, and therefore there was no President of the United States. There was no President of the United States during that first 12 or 13 years. There was a Congress, but no president. And I think there was also no courts, but that's another matter. No national courts, right? But let's focus on that executive and legislative idea first. Or here, leave the courts for next week, okay? I think that's a reflection of their distaste for executive authority that was a legacy of the colonial period. I think the fact that there was no executive under the Articles of Confederation is a pretty good indication that Americans during that period greatly distrusted executive authority. I mean, after all, they associated what they perceived as their loss of rights and liberties during the colonial period with not just abuses of the king's authority, but what was the king's position in the British system of government at that time. The king was the executive, right? They had, in the British system, they had a parliament, which was the legislative function. They had courts, the judicial function, and they had a monarchy, which was the executive branch of government. And so when Jefferson, if you read the Declaration of Independence, and Jefferson is pointing his finger at George III and placing the blame on George III for all of those abuses of authority, all of those losses of rights and liberty that the Americans ascribed to the king during the colonial period, I think it's important to note that when they get around to setting up their own system of government, they declare independence, they're going to have their own system of government. They're certainly not going to have a king. That's pretty clear. That's one thing they're not going to have. They're going to have a republican system, right? But they also are very distrustful of executive authority, so much so that they don't even create an executive branch of government. And we talked about that a little bit earlier in the semester, and we said, well, that created all sorts of problems for them in that early national period. And it didn't take them long to figure out, well, maybe distrust executive authority, but we've got to have an executive authority, because if you don't have executive authority, then that renders the legislative power moot. One thing to be able to make the laws, but if you can't execute the laws, it really doesn't matter if you can make the laws. So they figured it out pretty quickly. By 1787, there was almost universal agreement at the Constitutional Convention that there needed to be an executive. But what I'm really telling you is that their distrust of executive authority did not go away. They continued to distrust executive authority. And if you think about the balance of the powers of the national government, the powers that are vested in Congress versus those that are vested in the presidency, we see that the list of powers that are vested by the Constitution in Congress are not only more numerous, the list is much longer, but they're also much more impressive. And again, I think that's a reflection of their distrust of executive authority. You know, not only did, during that early national period, was there not a president under the Articles of Confederation, but most of the states that were in existence of them, of the 13 states, most of them, they either didn't have a governor at all, or whatever, if they had a governor, whatever authority the governor had was largely symbolic or ceremonial. State governors didn't really have any real executive authority for the most part. And so finally on that point, I'll appeal to the father of the Constitution, James Madison. Who remembers why we said Madison is considered to be the father of the Constitution, or referred to as the father of the Constitution? Much earlier in the semester, we touched on that point. Well, he was the principal architect of the Virginia Plan, right, which became the template, essentially, for the Constitution. He and George Mason were the principal architects of the Virginia Plan. Right? He took copious notes at the Constitutional Convention, so that even down to today, whenever we have questions about what the framers of the Constitution intended by this provision or that provision, one of the first places that we turn to is Madison's notes. There were others at the convention who took notes, but none were as complete as Madison's. So it's considered to be one of the authoritative sources. And he was also one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, which we've said was so instrumental in the ratification of the Constitution. He and Hamilton were the two primary authors of the Federalist Papers. So let me appeal to Madison. And in Federalist number 31, Madison writes, in a Republican government, the legislature necessarily predominates. I think that one little sentence says volumes about the mentality not only of Madison, but most of Madison's contemporaries. That in a Republican system of government, the bulk of the power ought to be vested in the legislature. The legislature necessarily predominates. Okay? So, the framers were envisioning, even by their standards in the late 18th century, a weak executive. Forget the standards of the early 21st century. Even by their standards, they were envisioning a weak executive. So I suspect that if we could bring Madison back and have him look at his handiwork, Mr. Madison, your system still survives, your model still survives, he might reject that. This is not what we created. I think he would say, possibly say, this is not Republican government. The extent to which power has gravitated to the presidency, Congress's powers have also increased as well. I mean, the Congress of 2021, the 117th Congress, exercises far more authority than the first Congress did back in 1789. So I think he would be amazed by that development as well. But just in terms of this distribution of power between the legislative branch and the executive branch, I think far more power has shifted to the presidency than he or any of his contemporaries could have ever envisioned. And I think they might think that it's dangerous. We might say, but it's necessary for the time that we live in. I'm not sure, your speculation is as good as mine. I'm not sure how he would react. All we know is based on the writings that he had a clear preference, and most of them had a clear preference for legislative power. They didn't look to the presidency as the preeminent institution of government. And by the way, that remained the case through most of the 19th century and even into the early part of the 20th century. Now, there was a long period of our history where Congress was at least a co-equal to the president, and in many cases far more powerful. Can you imagine a former president today? Can you imagine President Clinton or President George W. Bush or Donald Trump running at once their term as president was over, running for Congress and serving a term in Congress? It would be embarrassing probably. It would be like a demotion. But that's exactly what John Quincy Adams did. After he had served as president, he served in the United States Congress. And again, I don't want to make a big deal about one case, but I think it's some evidence that in those days they didn't perceive Congress as inferior to the president or beneath the president. As I said, it really wasn't until the early 20th century, particularly the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, where those perceptions began to change dramatically, and we began to see dramatic shifts in power to the presidency. So for about the last, 90 to 100 years, really. Okay, one of the ways that we can demonstrate that the framers intended for the presidency to be a weak executive is the fact that, as I hinted a little bit earlier, the list of powers vested by the Constitution of the president is a relatively short list. I'm going to show that to you right now, okay? I'm going to show you. We don't actually have to look at the Constitution and fish it out. Right? I've already done that for you, okay? So one of the powers that the Constitution expressly vests in the president is the power to be chief executive. But I already suggested to you that it follows with that phrase about taking care that the laws be faithfully executed, making it sound almost like an administrative role or a ministerial role, okay? We've said that the president, that the Constitution says that the president will be commander-in-chief, but we said that it certainly doesn't specify what it means to be commander-in-chief, what the powers of the commander-in-chief are. The president has the power to veto legislation. So the president is going to be potentially an important player in the legislative process. But again, that has evolved. It really wasn't until the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the 1830s that presidents vetoed legislation on anything other than constitutional grounds. The first several presidents only vetoed acts of Congress if they believed that Congress had overstepped its constitutional authority. It really wasn't until Andrew Jackson that presidents began vetoing acts of Congress on policy grounds. You understand the distinction that I'm making? That the early presidents thought that their power was limited here. We really only have the power in the Constitution to thwart Congress's legislative power if Congress is overstepping its authority. A little bit later, certainly by the time we get to the 20th century, it's becoming commonplace for presidents to veto on policy grounds, not because Congress has overstepped its authority, but just because they don't agree with the objectives of the legislation. The president has the power under the Constitution to nominate other executives, judges, and ambassadors. The president has the power to negotiate treaties. The president has the power to grant pardons. And the president has the power to convene Congress in special sessions. That's it, folks. That's the list. So it is indeed a short list, much shorter than the list of specific powers that are granted to Congress, to be sure. I want to further suggest to you that of the, how many are on here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Of the 7 items on this list, there's only one that the president can exercise unilaterally. What I mean by that is there's only one power on this list where the president's power is not shared with some other branch or institution of government. Anybody have a guess which one I'm talking about?
Negotiate treaties?
No, that's actually a shared power. I'll elaborate that point here in just a second. It's the power to grant pardons. That's the only one on the list that the president can exercise unilaterally, okay? There's no congressional check on that power. There's no judicial check on that power. Now, having said that, I will tell you that constitutional checks are one matter, and there are none on the president's power to do that. The president can presumably pardon anyone that's been convicted for any federal offense. Not for under state law, right? That's off the table, but there are political limitations, though, on the president's power to grant pardons. And that's why politically controversial pardons usually wait until the end of a president's term. It happens every time. It happened with Donald Trump. When Donald Trump was in his last few weeks of office, you may remember the news stories about some very controversial pardons that Donald Trump issued. It happened with Barack Obama before him, the end of Barack Obama's term, and George W. Bush before him, and Bill Clinton before him, and so on, right? So there are these political realities that a president must face, that if they still have some time to go in their presidency, particularly if they have the possibility of being reelected, right, they may just want to wait on any pardons that might be politically controversial and might jeopardize them politically. But that's a different matter. It's not a constitutional check. Okay? What we're talking about right now is the Constitution. Okay? Now, that leaves a half dozen. Now, of the half dozen that are left, there's one that I'm going to suggest to you is moot. M-O-O-T. M-O-O-T. Right? Moot, meaning no longer relevant. It's no longer a relevant power of the presidency. Anybody have a guess which one I'm talking about? Joanna, you have a guess? Well, you got the last one, so any thoughts? Which one is really no longer a relevant power of the president? Natalie, you have a guess? Look, you have a 1 in 6 shot, even if you're just guessing. Oh, yeah, that's it. The power to convene Congress in special sessions. Now, the harder question, if you were just guessing, like literally just guessing, that's a pretty low odds of getting that right, but you managed to get it, right? Maybe you're on a lucky streak and you should go to Vegas. Do you have any thoughts about why we suggest to you that that's a moot, no longer relevant power of the president? Well, quite simply, it's just because Congress is pretty much in session year-round. The modern Congress is pretty much in session year-round, and so there's not really an opportunity for the president to call Congress into a special session. I think the last time, it's been decades. I mean, literally decades. That might be like since the 1940s, something like that. That might not be too hard to find out. If somebody's interested, you could probably do a quick Google search or something, but my best guess is that it's been a long time since Congress was called into special session by the president. And again, that's simply because the modern Congress is pretty much in session. You see, under the Constitution, Congress convenes every year at the beginning of the year, right? After the, whatever it is, January the 3rd or whatever, right? And then it remains in session until it's finished its business. Congress has the authority under the Constitution to adjourn itself. That's different, for example, when you take your Texas government course, you're going to learn that the Texas legislature doesn't operate like that, okay? But we'll leave that for your 2306 course, okay? Congress is pretty much in session until Congress decides it doesn't need to be in session anymore. But the realities of modern life are that Congress is pretty much in session through December. In the last couple of Decembers, for example, Congress was busy drafting articles of impeachment against Donald Trump, if you recall, both in January of 2020 and December of 2020 and December of 2019. But even when you don't have an impeachment question on the table, there's legislative matters that Congress frequently is dealing with, at least up until Christmas recess or Christmas, adjourn around Christmas time, perhaps. Okay, so that one's moot. Okay, that leaves 5 on this list. Now, each of the remaining 5 are counterbalanced by some power vested in Congress. See, what I'm trying to emphasize to you here is the point that the Constitution contemplates, by our standards today, certainly, but I think also by the standards of the late 18th century, a weak chief executive. It's a short list, and most of the meaningful powers of the president that are left are counterbalanced by some power that's vested in Congress. So, for example, what counterbalancing power does Congress have to the president's power as chief executive? If in Congress's judgment it believes that the president is not faithfully executing the law as the Constitution specifies, what can Congress do? How can Congress check the president's power as chief executive? Well, I'm going to list several things for you here. The so-called power of the purse, right, just means that Congress has control over the appropriation of money. And so if Congress doesn't like the way that the president is executing federal law, federal programs, etc., it could try to use the leverage of appropriations to get the president to do what they want him to do. There's always the possibility of reorganizing the executive branch. That's not something that seems terribly likely, at least not very often, or maybe even a civic agency. Certainly, Congress invests some of its time and energy in the oversight function. Anybody remember what we mean by the oversight function? Probably we didn't really get into it in our discussion of Congress in any detail at all. We just mentioned it. But I think the authors of your textbook have some discussion of the oversight function. Anybody remember from the textbook what they were talking about? The oversight function?
Yeah, Congress can launch, I can't remember the term, but investigations
Sure.
into some of the bureaucracies, the work that they're doing, the money that they're appropriating.
Right. It's a Congress's ability, by holding hearings or forming special investigative committees, etc., to look into, call in testimony from executives, maybe a cabinet secretary or a department head or something like that. Yeah. Congress can pass new legislation. If Congress believes that the president is not executing the law faithfully, then Congress can always write new legislation, maybe providing more specific guidance to the implementation of the law. And I put up here as an example the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. This was a law passed by Congress in the wake of Watergate. And while Nixon was immersed, the Watergate scandal was swirling. There was a new emphasis on money and tracking money and making sure that money is spent for intended purposes and so on. Presidents had, since Thomas Jefferson, at least occasionally exercised a power called impoundment. That's a power that presidents exercise when Congress appropriates money for a specific purpose and they simply refuse to spend the appropriated money. As I said, I think the first president to do that was Thomas Jefferson, so pretty early on. But it was pretty rare, even into the 20th century, until you get to the Nixon presidency. And Nixon went dippy-do with the impoundment authority. Nixon's approach appeared to be simply that if he didn't agree with the purposes for which Congress had appropriated the money, he would just refuse to spend it. He would impound the money. Like your car gets impounded if you have it illegally parked, right? Take it away, put it somewhere, hide it away, can't get at it. And that was an increasingly used tactic in the Nixon presidency. So much so that Congress drafted legislation and passed that legislation. Now, Nixon undoubtedly would have vetoed that legislation had he not been immersed in the Watergate controversy. I think it was because Watergate was so, preeminent, issue for him that he just agreed to sign this legislation. But basically what Congress did in this legislation was say the president can no longer do that. The president must spend the money if it is. You see, because we would presume that if Congress appropriates money for purpose X, then Congress wants that money to be spent on purpose X, right? Isn't that a reasonable assumption? So if President Nixon is not doing that, then it seems reasonable that Congress would pass legislation saying, okay, we're just going to stop the president from impounding money. So now there's a period of time, it's something like 45 days or something like that, where if the president hasn't executed the budget expenditure consistent with the appropriations, then he has to present an explanation to Congress as to why, and Congress can take a vote, overriding the president's decision not to spend the money. That's essentially, I think, what the Budget Impoundment Control Act does. But again, it's just an example of what I'm talking about. If Congress doesn't believe that the president, more generally, if Congress doesn't believe that the Congress is, or that the president is, in his role as chief executive, faithfully executing the intent of the law, then they can write new legislation providing greater guidance or greater parameters, more rigid parameters for the president's execution. Okay? Okay, so there's a counterbalancing power vested in Congress there, in his power, and the president's power as chief executive. What is the counterbalancing power vested in Congress to the president's role as commander-in-chief? I promised you that we'd get into some discussion of that, so now's the time. Any thoughts there?
So the president can take the country to war for 30 days, but it has to go to Congress to extend that period?
Okay, so what you're talking about is something called the War Powers Resolution, which was passed by Congress in 1973. President Nixon vetoed that, but Congress overrode President Nixon's veto, which tells us that Congress was pretty determined to do that, okay? So let me start by saying that Congress has some sort of war-making role by virtue of the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, in Clause 1, and then in Clauses 11 through 16. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to call that up and look at it. You can do it on your own, and I invite you to do that, encourage you to do that, look at those clauses. But I think the most significant of those clauses is the one that says Congress will have the power to declare war. And it's very much worth noting that in the original drafts, that language was Congress shall have the power to make war. And it was deliberately moved to declare war. Okay? The original language read Congress shall have the power to make war. The president's power as it relates to war making is, of course, the commander-in-chief clause. But as I've said now a couple of times, it doesn't really spell out in any detail what it means to be commander-in-chief. I think the bottom line, if we're looking to the framers of the Constitution, is that there were some competing views on this. Okay? On one side, you had people like James Madison. Let me share a passage with you from Madison. Okay? Here is a essay, or part of an essay written by James Madison under the pen name of Helvidius. We know that this was Madison. Madison writes in 1793, so shortly after the Constitution went into effect, it remains to be inquired, whether there be anything in the Constitution itself which shows that the powers of making war and peace are considered of an executive nature and as comprehended within a general grant of executive power. In the general distribution of powers, we find out of declaring war expressly vested in the Congress, where every other legislative power is declared to be vested, and without any other qualification than what is common to every other legislative act. The constitutional idea of this power would seem then clearly to be that it is of a legislative and not an executive nature. I love this passage here. Madison is pointing his finger at you across the centuries, okay, and admonishing. He says, admonish the public. Every just view that can be taken of this subject admonishes the public of the necessity of a rigid adherence to the simple, the received, and the fundamental doctrine of the Constitution that the power to declare war, including the power of judging of the causes of war, is fully and exclusively vested in the Congress, in the legislature. That the executive, the president, has no right in any case to decide the question whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. How far we've come from that notion, right? We've traveled. That's why I say that one of the specific reasons I would say that Madison would say this is not Republican government. He wouldn't recognize it. This is not what I created. In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive. I don't think he could be any clearer on that matter. All right? Clearly, Madison and many others believe that the war-making power should be vested in Congress. Well, why was it moved from Congress shall have the power to make war to Congress shall have the power to declare war? Well, because there were others who were more in favor of executive authority here at that time. Elbridge Gerry, for example, but others, maybe James Wilson, I forgot where he might have come down on that, but certainly Alexander Hamilton, right, would have favored executive authority in this regard. So I think it's a compromise, that they decide to move that language to declare war to allow these sorts of issues to be worked out in practice, which they have been. But the upshot is, over 200 years of our history, is that has gradually meant that more and more war-making power has moved to the presidency. Anybody know when the last time Congress declared war? Anybody want to take a guess? When's the last congressional declaration of war?
World War II?
World War II, that's right. Yeah, we got two people got that, right? No declaration of war in Korea. No declaration of war in Vietnam. In fact, it was Vietnam, Korea, and to a much greater extent Vietnam, that resulted in the passage of the War Powers Act, right? Okay? Which we said, a moment ago, is Congress's attempt to kind of reel in the presidency. Congress is essentially saying in 1973, hey, wait a minute, we have some authority here in the area of war making as well. And you're right, Joanna, that's essentially the idea behind the War Powers Resolution. It's actually a very complicated piece of legislation. I don't know of many people who understand it thoroughly, including people in government. There's a lot of debate about which provision kicks in at what time, but more generally, there's some period of time that the president has to engage American forces in a hostile, quote unquote, a hostile environment. When that period of time expires, whether it's 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, whichever provision kicks in under whichever circumstance, I don't know. But at the end of that period of time, Congress can do one of two things. It can either take a vote and approve of what the president has done, leaving the troops in place, or it can take a vote, well, actually, it can do one of three things. That was the first one. Second was they can take a vote disapproving of the president's actions and requiring the president to withdraw, or Congress can take no vote at all, in which case the provision of the War Powers Act says that the president must withdraw forces. Now, it's pretty clear what Congress's intent was with that legislation, to rein in the president's war-making power, not let us get involved in another Vietnam, I think many critics would argue that it's had the exact opposite effect. What it essentially does is give the president a permission slip. Hey, if you can get the troops in and out in 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, whatever the case is, you got free reign. That's one criticism of the War Powers Act. Okay. All right, let's shut it down there. We may take a few minutes at the beginning of the class session on Thursday just to finish up these few thoughts on the presidency. We'll see. We may just move on to the bureaucracies. But right now, we've got to take that quiz. So if you will, go ahead and put everything away except for your Scantron form. We will get you started.